I have to accept it, right? Am I in progress?
Think you're good to go.
Okay. Well, I do want to thank Steve for. I didn't know if Steve ever did administrative assistant work in his life, Steve, but but he did help me because I haven't been able to get high-low and all the help I've gotten to work properly. So Steve was operating on my rhythm as I do my work and sending stuff out as I got it together. So I thank you for that very much, and also a couple of pointers as about how I might approach it. But then, no, I've made it my own. All right. So this morning I came across something just very briefly. This is just a statement to everybody here. This guy, Albert C. Brooks, was writing something about how to look after your life. And he came up with this term that Aristotle used. It's called autakei, otake. Anybody know Greek? But it means self-sufficiency. In my terms, it means critical thinking and independent thinking. So I ask two things of you: to listen and respect what I have to say, but definitely use that otoke to come to your own perspective and share them. So that's my intro. So did everybody get to see my overview? At least, because that's not too long. It was just I sent a lot of articles, and I cut it down from 50 articles to about 5. So just let you know, there's so much out there. All right. Again, it's an overview of empathy from 3 perspectives: evolutionary biology, psychology, and neuroscience. Let's see. This first installment, I'm going to give you an outline just to begin to think about the complexity of empathy, and then I give my own perspective on it, as you saw. But is empathy a basic emotion? Do non-mammals, non-human mammals, and humans differ in their capacity and expression of empathy? How does dual inheritance theory help us understand the origins and nature of empathy? What are the components of empathy, which I get into? Are there hierarchies of expressions of empathic experiences, as some authors use? I like that. Is compassion a higher order of empathic expression? I say it is. Are there gender and cultural differences in the expression of empathy or compassion? Literature says there are. I didn't get into it. Do empathic exchanges within groups foster pro-sociality? How easy or difficult is it for empathic exchanges to influence cooperation between groups? And last but not least, how do these phenomenon, affective contagion, mimicry, imitation, and taking another's perspective, influence the development and expression of collective empathy as well? So in my putting things together, this is more of an essay rather than academic thing, even though it's based on my research. And that I suggest that there are 3 types of empathy: primitive empathy, cognitive, and compassion. And I'll go over it in the second half that I sent out. But just to start, primitive empathy, or PE, cognitive empathy, CE, involve the capacity to resonate or tune into the whole gamut of non-human, mammalian, and human expression of emotions and moods. And the whole gamut of moods: positive, negative, happy, sad, excitement, grief, rage, anger. There's a list that goes on forever, separate from the 7 basic emotions that's been researched. That for PE, these are reflexive reactions, and CE, or controlled empathy, again for joy and delight, sadness, or other, are also reflexives, but a little bit of perspective taking. I also recommend that we consider viewing compassion as a specific type of empathy, uh, as the human and non-human mammalian ability to resonate to another's pain, distress, and or suffering with the goal of taking some action to lessen or diminish the pain. So that's my putting myself out on the line. That's my impression. So primitive empathy is a lower order experience wired for and based upon implicit and explicit communication. We'll see later the whole gamut of sensory apparatus, physiological apparatus, gestures. Lower animals, non-human animals, and humans have these capabilities. Primitive empathy is wired and involves emotional contagion, mimicry, and imitation. As you all will see later, these are the basic evolutionary underpinnings, this contagion, mimicry, and imitation. I don't think has been given enough study and research, especially in the field that I've been in for 45 years, psychotherapy. So this has been a great experience for me to see much more. Cognitive empathy has the same wired foundation of contagion and mimicry, but it includes perspective taking. It is a lower order experience wired for and based on implicit and explicit communication. Let me see. Let me skip that since people have read it because I want to spend more time on the other. But because I keep repeating the same thing like a good writer is supposed to do. So in my language, my words, primitive empathy is a non-thinking awareness. It's an awareness that there's something in the environment that's affecting me and somehow I am reacting or will be reacting. Cognitive empathy sounds like this. I'm aware of signals in the environment. I'm affected by these signals. I want to understand them. And how do I achieve some mastery of what I'm experiencing from my environment and what I'm experiencing in my own internal world? And compassion, I am picking up signals of distress and call for aid from another, and am compelled to relieve their discomfort, distress, or suffering. I'm somehow aware I'm doing something useful for the other. They may experience relief from their pain, and I will then have something good or altruistic, which may cause me to feel better. Later, we'll see that doesn't always work that way in terms of when empathy goes awry. Okay, in the other part, let's see, I'm going to define in a more fuller way compassion in the context of contagion, mimicry, imitation, which is primitive empathy. And then I'll discuss how empathy goes awry. And there are two main people that I've read, but I've sent some summaries. This German fellow who is in Indiana, this Fritz Breithaupt, and Paul Bloom. He gets a lot of press in this country. Okay. Compassion may be viewed as an emotion, even though it's not listed in the 7 primary emotions in the research. Where am I here? That is thought to serve as an internal signaling device, providing information about events in the environment, as well as guiding the individuals and possibly the groups, that's my thought, patterns of thoughts and actions in appropriate ways, whatever that means determined by culture. It is an evolved emotion. It may be universal, most think it is, and of course varies across cultures. My biggest thought, my main central perspective is that the precursors to compassion are contagion, mimicry, and imitation. We see it, and I've not been to India, but if you throw a banana at a monkey in the city somewhere, they throw it right back to you. They don't eat it. They just imitate what you did. So we can see that with animals. We see it with all of you who've had kids. You see, with pets, the basic way to live and learn and survive is through mimicry. Mimicry, like if it's like it even comes when you're a little older and kids have speech. And if you slip out and you usually don't curse at home and you go, fuck, and then all the little kids are going, fuck, 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 fuck. It's mimicry. I didn't know what that word meant for a long time, but my parents didn't use that. But they used Yiddish words, and I learned those quickly. So the origins, compassion evolved from the following early experiences: to caregiving responses to vulnerable offspring. I believe we're all pretty familiar with this. The search for compassionate individuals who were preferred for mate selection. I have a big question about that, but that's most of the research that I've seen. And we're looking for reciprocators and altruistic interactions with non-kin, and I would add kin. Uh, uh, the biggest thing that, one of the things that I really appreciated, I forget, it's Frank 1989 or something. He called it you've seen it, so I'm not going to go over it in detail, but what I've outlined, I like their language, appraisals of suffering, which may be influenced by the possible costs and benefits of aiding the suffering individual. So I think, or the group. So if we just think about our experiences in the big city, in the small city, warfare, you don't always come to somebody's aid because they're suffering. For some of these compassion-related appraisals. So in my own words, what do I have to gain or lose if I become aware of and act on this wired instinct or emotion that has been shaped by my culture? So I like to put things in my words, and like Sage once said, I get practical about things too. So one big one is the relevance of the sufferers to the self. And the two criteria that some people use are if they're important to our well-being. One is, does the sufferer, is it part of my group or kin, or is somebody I don't like, or somebody who's I'm xenophobic about? I don't know if I'm going to care about them too much. Does the sufferer have similar broader goals and values that I have? And that's easy to see. We have a big split in our country, this artificial but seemingly real, two very different broader goals, whatever you want to look at them on a manifest level or at a more latent level. The other, I think we're all familiar with it, but is the sufferer blameworthy for their negative outcome? In other words, did they go out of their way to make their lives miserable? And everybody sees it, everybody knows it, and we go, they're not worth it. Something like that. Now, this once about us, the one who's being compassionate. Do we have confidence in our own ability to cope with the situation at hand? If there's 9 guys beating up on somebody, and I don't have a gun or a knife, and I don't have anybody to help me, I may not come to their rescue and eliminate their pain. And the other, is there a signal of commitment and cooperation from the sufferers? So somebody who's not on your wavelength, somebody you're not that involved with, you might let it go. All right. So I don't know if this is, it doesn't feel like a load of information to me because I've been immersed in this for about a month and a half. So I try to make it as pithy and not simplistic, but reductionistic as possible, so we can then build on it in a 45-minute discussion, which I hope will go on forever. But so that's what can we do with it? So the last part is, let's say, does empathy or compassion go awry? If you read that stuff or going to read their books, which I'd read Brighthouse book rather than Bloom. Bloom is more of a popular smart guy. This other guy is kind of nobody really likes him because he puts takes us out of this naive sense about empathy and prosociality, or the cat's meow. So I asked that question later. It's not that I don't think it's important, but I'll make my comments later. So I said that I wrote it down. Okay. Okay, so both authors seem to have this in common. They believe that harm occurs, then we the empathizer or compassioner, can get in trouble. And in other words, there's a preponderance of over empathy or hyper empathy. I don't know if you've all seen that in the world, but I guess people who practice mindfulness and meditation are probably, or teach it, you've probably seen that in the greater public. As a therapist, you see people who have a minimal empathy or compassion, and they overdo it, that they burn out, which is called empathy distress. In other words, the agreements by both of these writers is that the compassionate one may turn away from the sufferer, or what I see happen a lot too, turn against the sufferer. In other words, pro-social behavior will not be the outcome here. So I just want to give people a moment or two to kind of digest it and see how it sort of filters through and what your critical thinking is. So I think it needs a minute or two. I hope that's okay, and I hope I'm not too far past my time, but I only have, all right, I'll keep quiet.
Shall we form a queue, folks? Raise your hand. Or...
Yeah, might as well. You're going to take care of that, right, Sage?
I think well, I see
me.
Diane raising her hand, and then if people use their digital hand under the reactions.
Will you use that, Sage? Will you monitor that?
Sure.
Okay, let me just read my questions. But remember,
I think Diane had her hand up, Hank.
Okay, yeah, I just want to read I asked some silence. I provided it. I just wanted to say this. This is a question that I thought would be very provocative. The second one, but if compassion has evolved to promote pro-sociality, what can occur when empathy goes awry and takes over? Empathy going awry takes over. The other is the bigger one. What are each one of our views about the coexistence of compassion, pro-sociality, which involves sacrifice, and self-interest that may involve competition, selfishness, and greed? I am not an expert. I once read that how do you become an expert? You say I'm an expert, and then you behave as an expert. But I'm scholarly inclined, but I'm not a real scholar. So I don't expect to answer many questions, but I hope we all can respond, but I'll do my part since I did the research. Thank you. Sage, you're gonna?
Diane, do you want to kick us off?
Okay, well, let me start with the first question, because there is a sort of popular literature on what happens when empathy goes awry. I mean, how does it go awry? By basically immobilizing the helper. That is, if you're so caught up in sharing the emotion that you're observing, that you can't think what to do, it's not very useful. So I was happy when Hank said he wanted to focus on compassion instead of empathy, because that presupposes a little bit of balance there, so that you're calculating your possibilities and possible efficacy at the same time that you're feeling, what the state of the other is. And to the second question, obviously, you have to say, can I do it? And if I do it, what's going to happen to me? So that's the dilemma that compassion poses for us. By the way, Bloom wrote a whole book about why we should focus on not on empathy because it's debilitating.
Right. But you know, he calls it, you remember what he calls his, remember, he's got to come up with a school of thought. What does he call it? Uh, Rational empathy.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of what Andy Norman is addressing, not through empathy, but the use of rational, or what I would call the sort of a differentiated cognition that keeps us separate from our emotions. Some of you who know a little Buddhism, one of the tenets of Buddhism is in mindfulness is you are not your thoughts, your feelings, or your actions. And if you study that a little bit more, you get a good sense of what Bloom is trying to do, what Andy Norman is doing in his way, and what I'm suggesting also.
It's like we have Alan and then Rob.
I guess I got to unmute. Okay, so I'm not precisely sure how to plug this in, but I think it's relevant. And so I don't know if people are aware of the Dutch experiments with the trolley problem and people's names, but if you, the trolley problem is you push somebody off the bridge to save some other people. If you give those people names, and this is in Holland, so one has a Dutch name, one has a German name, and one has Muhammad. So different ethnicities, and you do the experiment and everybody comes out kind of the same, and then you spritz them with oxytocin, and it's pretty bad for you if your name is Hans or Muhammad. You're going off the bridge at a much higher frequency. And so I view empathy as a system. And within the context of multi-level selection, if human evolution is a team sport, your effectiveness, let's take an extreme example, in a raid or defending against a raid, is based on your ability to work as a team, predict what other people are going to do, support each other. If one person breaks and runs, particularly like in a classic Greek battle, the line starts to collapse. So you need to simultaneously be highly empathetic to a certain extent with your team, but it has to be able to be turned off for the other team that you're trying to frankly obliterate, or even in a milder form of competition. So my perspective on empathy is that that's kind of the root of it, and why we're so much more pro-social, and hence capable of empathy than other species. And I mean, that's reductive, but I think it has to kind of be conciliant with that, particularly in the context of multi-level selection, which you were talking about.
Well, since I'd like to take the privilege of responding to Alan only in the sense of that I view, other than compassion, I view empathy as we're not aware of it. It's below the 10% of awareness of the brain, and it's reflexive. And so if we use the term, my way of looking at it as compassion, where like in pro-social world, there's a whole system that I'm not part of every day, but many of you are, Sage and Steve, and about the design principles. They can provide the greater option of being taking more risks at compassion because the system and the environment allows it. But that's also valuing this highest level, whereas the first two levels, especially primitive empathy, it's just reactive, like your dog, like a baby, or when we're startled. So that's what I want to add to your. So if you could shift that, you might have a different take on what you're describing in these philosophy thought experiments.
There's an organization called the Carnegie Hero, gives out Carnegie Hero medals to people that rush in and make rescues. And it's definitely knee-jerk, and 20% of the awardees are dead because they died in their attempt to rescue somebody.
It looks,
Yeah, I remember I used the term sacrifice, and I was being very kind, but it does require varying degrees of sacrifice.
so we have Rob and then Steve. And an interesting exchange in the chat. Maybe you'll touch on that, Steve.
Rob will try to be quick. One thing is that we are using a lot of different words to mean overlapping things, and I like to look at the etymology of words. Empathy means to feel or suffer in other words, to be identified completely with the person or subject that you're have empathy for. Compassion means to feel with, as does sympathy. Both of them mean to feel with. Altruism is another, sort of part of that domain. And I think all of these things mean slightly different things. And the other thing I wanted to bring up was that empaths as a trope is a very common science fiction trope. And often they're used as good guys in science fiction, but they're also the most famous one being the mule in the in Asimov's Foundation series.
Right.
Is as an empath who manipulates people because he knows how they feel. So, and the idea of empathy as a kind of manipulation, I think, is another interesting thing to think about. So sympathy, compassion, and altruism, all part of a range of, I guess they're emotions, but they're in science fiction and empath, it's a talent. Oh,
Rob, thanks. I agree with you, but this is just because of my premise for today's presentation. I mean, your perspective is a highly valued one with linguistic etymology, but I'm suggesting a more evolutionary biology, psychology frame of reference that I would say overshadows this other linguistic stuff that's been part of popular educated people's culture for a long time. So that's why I put it together that way, to try to come to some definition we could at least agree on temporarily to discuss this very complex, almost dangerous phenomenon to talk about. But thank you for clarifying the nuances. Yeah.
Steve and then Bruce.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a sort of larger perspective in which to place discussions of empathy and compassion and altruism. And that is that all creatures, including us, that interact with conspecifics have to be able to predict and respond to what the other people or animals in their group are doing. And so I think the larger umbrella is mind reading. That's the larger umbrella topic, is having a theory of mind and being able to predict and respond to what other people are doing. We could talk about empathy in animals in the context of their ability to do that, and whether or not they have a theory of mind. So I think that's a good way to think about all of these topics. Second comment that I would make is if we remember the session we had a while back on Nessie's approach to evolutionary psychiatry and evolutionary clinical psychology, Nessie talks about understanding dysfunction as when an adaptive emotion is either excessive or deficient. And I think that's a useful way to think about empathy. Empathy and compassion is adaptive unless it's either excessive, in which you maybe are one of the 20% that die when they rush to save somebody, or have compassion fatigue or burnout. And empathy can be deficient in which case one is going to be perceived as fairly selfish and self-involved and not very reactive to others. And there are both trait and state differences in that regard. Last thing, and we may or may not get to this, but I think another interesting question that we might have time to get to towards the end is, are women more empathic than men? Are there sex differences in what I would call trait empathy rather than state empathy?
Steve, let me just, on that question, I'm not going to respond. I just want to ask us to think about, I guess we've probably all had parents, and I had a mother and father, and my father was more empathic than my mother, more compassionate. So I'd like you to just think about it, not in terms of theoretical, conceptual, bigger picture stuff, but who you run into and what do you see? I mean, it's an invalid statistical sample, but it kind of gives you a feel about the stereotypes that go on about that. Yeah. Steve, one more thing. I would, when you say mind read, because of what I've been learning about embodiment, I would call it mind body read, only because of some other literature that's not as popular, because it does have, everything comes from the body first. Even Freud said the first ego is the body ego. So
what I really
stuff,
mean by mind read is intentionality prediction.
I
need to predict what you are going to do. If I am unable to do that, I am probably going to lose out in the evolutionary arms race. And so that mind reading really is, I need to predict your behavior, particularly behavior towards me. And so that's what I mean by mind read. And the paper that one of the papers that you gave us to read was the Maffasioni and Lockman paper. That was the one about that used game theory and ran simulations. It was a difficult read if you're not into math, but if you I thought it was really an excellent paper. I paid more attention to the forest rather than worried about understanding every tree they had in the paper. But yeah, I like that paper.
So we have Bruce.
Yes, interesting. I've approached this from a more practical than theoretical level, and I'm intrigued by your introduction of the idea of what you might call the primitive or reactive versus perhaps a more cognitive or more highly developed type of response. And in the work I do in consulting, I do a fair bit of work with non-for-profits who are working in say family service situations where the staff is working with crisis situations on a regular basis. And so empathy has a role that can't be over, we all know about the burnout and everything else. So one of the things we teach is what we call the empathy dial. And the idea that, yes, you need to have some empathy for the clients you're working with, the families you're visiting. And if you get too far into somebody who is highly distressed and you are mirroring too much of that, you're unable to function, unable to be supportive to them. And so one of the things that we recognize is that what's happening is you're not just mirroring thoughts or feelings, you're mirroring body posture, you're mirroring tone of voice, you're mirroring facial expression. So what we teach them is when you find yourself getting into that place, shift your body posture, shift your tone of voice, shift your facial expression, and that facial feedback returns you to a place where you're less empathic. So what happens when we start to teach this to that staff is, oh, no, we can't do that. It's our job to be empathic. And what I say to them, no, your job is to be compassionate. And compassion is one of these, as you're pointing out, a kind of a higher level approach, because empathy means I feel what you're feeling, I'm living what you're living. Compassion means, as you said, I see what you're experiencing and I want to help. So we teach them to dial back empathy, but recognize that compassion is a separate function. You can dial your empathy down and still feel full compassion. So I think this idea that these are really physiologically separate systems And physiologically changing your empathic response does not physiologically change your compassionate response. And we can develop a set of competencies as we do this kind of work that lets us, and if your empathy dial is too low and you don't give a shit about what's going on, you can start also using these body cues of, mirroring the facial expression, tone, and bring yourself up. So we teach them to turn down or turn up the empathy dial while maintaining compassion. I don't know if that resonates with any of the theory. It's more of a practical consulting piece.
Well, it's fabulous. I'd like to know more about what you guys are doing, but I would like to go back to what I've been in the premises today that I think is more important than we realize: the automaticity of what's called empathy. I'd rather call it, instead of empathy, I'd rather call it contagion, mimicry, and what was the other one? Imitation. And I think there's not an, especially in the world that I'm in, is a bunch of therapists, thousands of them over the years, and lots of conference. And what you see is a great misunderstanding when you're treating individuals or groups of families. They're missing out what I've seen about how the contagion affects people, and how contagion, if we think about what Steve was saying, that has to do not with mental illness, but suffering. That suffering is contagious. I wouldn't call it empathy, except if empathy is contagion, mimicking, and imitating, yes. So Bruce, I'm wondering if you think of it that way, you'd have a different way of approaching the students, the practitioners, in recognizing the difference between the body's reaction. I'll just say one more thing. As a psychotherapist for a long time, myself and some other people, very few think of what's called like if you're a trombone player, your instrument is a trombone. So my instrument is I call it the therapeutic instrument, and involves resonating to all of these levels: compassion, mimicking, how that gets communicated to me, how I pick it up in my body, how I study it, how I separate what's coming at me from how I interpreted my subjective meaning. And others have found all kinds of ways of trying to sort that out, Bruce, like you say, practically, in the moment, in time, in a session. So, but I would love to hear more about what you guys do, and if you could put something in the chat, or you said what it was.
We call it the empathy dial. I mean, some of this is based on polyvagal theory, but one of the challenges when you're doing TD with an organization is it has to be really simple. You've got them there for a day, maybe 2 days max, and you can't give them a whole. They're not interested in the academia, the theory. That they want to know how am I going to make a difference in the work that I do. So, like Einstein says, if you can only say things simply if you really understand it deeply. So I do appreciate the extra layers that this is giving, which might inform the way in which we approach, but probably won't be contained in the information we give the staff, because it just gets too complicated.
So we have Kenneth, and then Steve.
Okay, see if I can talk fast. Just to respond to Hank's reference to Buddhism and mindfulness, the idea there is that, humans are essentially afflicted by drives, by strong inclinations, and the two that are effective, are noticed here, are the family altruism and the group tribal altruism. And so that through Buddhism and mindfulness, the way one deals with that is that one transcends those. One finds a way to actually see those drives coming up and to be able to essentially set them aside. And that is described as finding, essentially lowering the boundaries that separate us. And so one simply by transcending those no longer is driven to push people out of the family or out of the group. This out of group, out of family feeling disappears. Very difficult to achieve. And just wanted to mention too, that the whole idea, we haven't talked too much, we talked a little bit about pathological altruism, not pathological altruism and compassion. And that is that, and I just put a nice little quote up by Sam Harris, who said to be moved to action by empathy is to lurch blindly towards who knows what. I would say that to move to action purely by empathy, and that it is effective compassion requires discretion. Very often, blind compassion removes agency from the receiver, enables bad behavior on the part of the receiver. Look at what we did. Look at everything we gave to Haiti in the 60s and the 70s, and look at the result. The country cannot govern itself. And what's the last one I was going to say? Compassion. Oh yeah, and of course, one can engage in compassion if one doesn't disengage one's own selfish drives. One can engage in compassion in order to satisfy, in order to feel good about oneself, which is clearly the selfish motives are a problem. And I'm just going to leave it at that.
Well, Ken, I think it's a nice little summary. When I try to apply this kind of, let's call it Buddhist thinking as compared to sort of modern American European mental health, don't use enough of this in psychoanalytic thinking. You want to help somebody become differentiated, or not detached, but detachment in Buddhism from their thoughts, feelings, sensation, and actions. So I think Chris said something. Where are you? Is Chris here? Oh, there you are. Yeah. Oh, I didn't see your name. Yeah. So the main aim is in the Buddhist teaching, and what I'm suggesting, based upon my own work and other readings, is we want to help people be able to better identify what's coming at us on the most primitive level. You can see it more from your dog. I have a little dog. We get to read each other pretty well. I know her actions. She mimics me. I mimic her. She watches me like anything, and she knows how to move. That's that theory of mind that the research says dogs have. But the subtleties, and I'm saying this to Bruce too, the subtleties of what comes at us, which in the mental health domain are called sort of emotional contagion, not in the sense that we're affected by what's going on around us and we don't know it. That's before we have theory of mind. So you have to be able to apply theory of mind to detect these implicit, subtle, non-tangible, primitive, call it emotions, whether it's distress or joy. So I have a client who's in a lot of trouble now, and I'm trying to help him separate from some of his emotions and belief are out of control. So I said to him, we need to do two things. We need to help you be mindful and separate from your thoughts. Your thoughts and feelings are not yours, but you're a witness to them. And the other is to incorporate self-compassion, because he hates himself. And he hates himself. Doesn't matter. I don't want to get into it, but he does. He had the Catholic Church help him hate himself even more than somebody who wasn't involved in the dogma. He was a brother in the church. He's a gay guy. He hid being gay from the whole world. I mean, there's a lot in there. And the guy, it's finally catching up to him. He was pretending there were no problems. So now he's got no coping mechanisms, like you say, Steve. And he's got to find new coping mechanisms, separate. And he, at some level, he's going to have to acknowledge he's betraying his primitive beliefs of the Catholic Church from thousands of years ago, not his modern post, Second Vatican. It's not helping him. The thinking. All right, so all right, that's enough. I got so much to say, but I got to be careful. Yeah.
I'm wondering if we could shift for a moment from an individual lens to a cultural lens. And I was thinking, as Bruce was talking about the problem in helping professions of excessive compassion or excessive empathy, passion fatigue. But as I look at American culture, that's not the problem I see at large. The problem I see in our culture is a marked deficiency of empathy, particularly for anybody who might be in any type of an outgroup. So
Mhm.
the question I'd like to toss out is, are there cultural differences? Are some cultures more empathic, more compassionate, pick your term, than others? Are collectivist cultures more compassionate than individualistic cultures? And we live in probably one of the most highly, if not the most highly individualistic culture that is extant right now. Are there differences within subcultures in a culture? So we're all born with this dial for empathy and compassion, but our cultures may set where, the range of that dial. So I'm really curious what people think about cultural differences in compassion and empathy, and how America, at least in 2024, stacks up in that.
Steve, I just have a quick response. Not, this is Powell. We should have a session on that, even if you don't want to chair it. But I think it's a big deal for us to spend time on that question, not just for a couple of seconds.
I saw Diane's hand go up as I was speaking, so maybe she had a reaction.
Yeah, I wanted to say a word or two about collectivism versus individualism.
Mhm.
People who live in collectivistic cultures are not necessarily more compassionate towards one another, but I think they probably use empathy a lot more than individualists do, in the sense that they have to be sensitive to the effect that they're going to have on other people.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a great deal of sort of, self-control involved in collectivism, because you're very concerned not to damage the relationship and not damage the other one. Sometimes that means damaging yourself, however. Whereas in individualistic culture, I think there's much less of that concern over the effect of your actions.
So there's more inhibition that goes on in collectivist cultures.
Yeah, collectivistic culture is quite inhibited, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know whether that really says anything to expression of compassion
That's
in
interesting.
an active way.
If I'm going to be able to inhibit my behavior, I would think being more empathic would help me inhibit better.
Maybe. Yeah, that's more or less what I was.
Well, and which
sort of
implies,
feeling.
therefore, that collectivist cultures might have their empathy dial set higher than individualistic cultures. At any rate, I just don't find America very empathic at the moment.
Well,
No.
Steve, I say I didn't get into all of the stuff about, we'll call it empathy now, but compassion. I think we're living in based on what you're saying, an anti-compassion culture. In group, I don't know if they like each other. I'm not in that particular, I don't know what in group I'm in, but I'm not in favor of hurting people that much and taking over the government. But in that in group, they're supposed to like each other, right? You're supposed to, or like Diane said, it's a collectivist culture. You do whatever you can to not get, there's a new term out that I didn't know about. I saw it in a piece of literature. It's called ostracism anxiety, which really fits our evolutionary thinking about the worst thing that could happen to you is be ostracized, not just the executioner's hypothesis, but to be ostracized is worse than them knocking you off.
Well, when you live in a cancel culture, you're going to have that anxiety.
Right. Yeah.
We have
Well,
last few minutes with Kenneth and Alan.
Okay, just very quickly, what's happening, Steve, is that, first of all, in the West, I think the West is actually more empathic than the East, because this universal compassion, which is something that has evolved uh, culturally, it certainly is not a genetic. It seems to be expressed more in the West. But what is happening in the United States is that basically we're collapsing into smaller groups. The concept of a nation as the primary eusocial tribal group is beginning to fade, and people are falling back. They're either joining a political party or a religion or a particular philosophy, and this is happening, of course, vertically in layers, since you have layers of groups. And so that's what's happening. And so what you're witnessing is a lack of empathy, because you're finding that there are more people who identify themselves as groups and do not have empathy for the outgroup members. We're simply losing that coalition that we had as a nation that's falling apart. And we're not doing it. Not doing a particularly good job of holding it together. China, on the other hand, seems to be doing a better job of holding it together, but to do so, it's being very brutal. If you observe the work that it's doing in the Muslim areas, but it's doing a better job of controlling some of this decay into smaller eusocial groups. Done.
Alan?
Okay, well, I'm going to take all the context off of this in order to be brief, but what I was thinking when we were talking about the lack of empathy in our culture is that the flip side is the loneliness epidemic in our culture.
That's my suggested topic for next month.
Okay, excellent. I'm trying to cue you up.
Yeah.
And the second thing I wanted to point out, if we drop back to an evolutionary level, is that being dead is not necessarily a drawback evolutionarily, depending on who is not dead at the end of your being dead. So
it's all about the
Yes.
genes.
If I die saving my child's life, that's different genetically than if I die saving non-kin. Yes.
right.
Or
But
if you
from a
save
multi-level
your social groups
perspective,
member.
advancing my group could all be the equivalent of
Yeah.
a kin selection.
I often say that most parents would die for their child, but the reason is because their child is them.
Right.
But then there are people who die for their platoon.
That's right.
Yes, and I was thinking, we don't have time to go into it now, but I was thinking when I did pose the question about sex differences in empathy and compassion, there's situational components to that. Men are clearly capable of being extremely empathic and compassionate in certain situations, combat being one.
But if you consider that all of the theories that Hank introduces to assume that compassion is originally based on the care for offspring.
Yeah.
I think it would be likely that at least it's more socially developed in the average female than in the average male.
Right, and to the degree that competitiveness is to some sense the opposite side of compassion. If men are more competitive than women, or at least in certain ways, that could imply, overall less empathic. But
all this is context dependent.
Yes, it's all context.
So the Russian and die heroes are predominantly men, but if you look at who risked their life to save people from the Nazis, the balance shifts towards women.
Look at Joan of Arc.
There's also a biological component, at least to altruism. They've done studies of people who have donated organs, donated kidney, and they've got, I think, larger amygdalas. Is that right? Or something. There's actually a brain anatomy component to serious altruism.
Well, so sign me up for one on heroism at some point, which I think gathers together all these threads that we're lobbing in here at the end, like somebody that donates an organ or rushes in and dies, or save
Well,
somebody from the Nazis is a hero. And that's, altruism and empathy have got to. And I've been, my writing group is arguing about, do heroes have to be lunkheads? So I've got some material.
There's also, when you mentioned the brain, I was thinking of brain development, and there are, we didn't have time, but you can talk about empathy in an individual development. And my understanding in child psych is that children may show rudimentary signs of empathy, rudimentary in a primitive way of perhaps mimicking, like Hank was talking about. But what we would define as kind of mature empathy, I think you don't see that in children until about age 3.
Yeah, that's some of the
Yeah,
research I was
well,
reading. Yeah.
as Hank was saying, maybe it's in tandem with development of theory of mind, because that begins to peak around 4.
Yeah, it would seem like you couldn't really, how could you have empathy without a theory of mind? Yeah, exactly.
Well, you can based upon contagion, imitation, and mimicry. It's not empathy.
Primitive.
Okay. I wanted to say to Alan for the heroes, you ever hear the difference between a hero and a fool? Hero knows that there's danger out there and they go pursue it. A fool just doesn't know what the hell's going on. And
Yeah.
yeah, but I like Steve's notion of, I would do it someday, not collectivism, but what do you call it? Competition versus, not versus, and compassion. Like my last question. I would like to do that someday as we take our turn. Diane, weren't you doing something next time?
Diane and I had an exchange, and I'm wondering because I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to make it to the August session. I'm going to be up where I might not have good internet. So I'm not positive. So my suggestion would be that I would be interested in leading a discussion next month on loneliness. And I did come across a evolutionary theory of loneliness that I thought would, and there's one paper we could read on that might kick off a good discussion. And Diane we've talked about possibly Diane doing something on cultural norms. Mm-hmm. Maybe we could do that in August if Diane's willing. That we've touched on those kind of issues today when we were talking about cultural differences in empathy.
Maybe we should take a poll and see how many people are going to be available in August. Maybe we should take a vacation.
I'll be available if the internet allows me. It's hard. I don't know if people can predict, but.
Well, what's the date? What would be the date?
It's always the
third,
what is today, the third
Thursday.
Yeah, it's always the third Thursday.
No.
Sage, I have a practical question. Does the Examine Lives thing go out to pro-social as well?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, because nobody seems to come from the bigger pro-social to our little group.
Well, I see Joe Carson here, and he's somebody, we don't see his face, but hi, Joe. If so,
welcome. Oh, good. That's, at least we got one.
There he is.
All right, thank you for being a representative. Yeah,
there's always some percolation.
But yeah. Steve, I would do this at some point. Competition versus not altruism, but what do I call it?
Does my suggestion sit well with people? We do loneliness in July, and Diane can talk about norms in August. Is that okay, Diane, with you?
Fine with me.
I'm good.
And also, Steve, just so you know, if you do find yourself in August with not great internet, but you can manage to get like a cell signal, you can always just call in like a regular call. But we can figure that out before. I think that sounds great. So Steve will do loneliness, and then we'll slot Diane. Long awaited Diane. You've been planning on it for a couple months.
Steve, I have a song for you. I'm Just a Lonely Boy by Paul Anka.
You're dating yourself, Hank.
I know. We're just a lonely people.
I remember that.
Oh, the Beatles. Remember that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for doing both that I asked. Listen to me and value it and do your own thing.
Thanks for all your work on this, Hank, for leading the discussion, and the articles you found were very, very interesting. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
All
Hank.
right, we'll see you next month for loneliness.
Bye.
Bye.
Right, bye, everyone.